This is Max Allen Collins. Please stick around and help me solve the incredible mystery of Mr. Media.
Today on Mr. Media, I'll talk to novelist Daniel Stashower, the author of the Harry Houdini Mysteries series, featuring the world's most famous magician before he became that guy. The latest in the series, the Houdini Specter. Stick around and watch me pull a rabbit out of my hat. Mr. Media is recorded live before a studio audience of beautiful young magician's assistants tired of being sawed in half and left that way in the new media capital of the world, St. Petersburg, Florida. If I was really good at this whole interviewing gig, I would have invited one of my previous guests, actor Paul Michael Glaser, to return to be part of the conversation today. Glaser was the person who first brought the great Harry Houdini to my attention when he played the master magician and escape artist in The Great Houdini, a thrilling 1976 ABC Movie of the Week. It was one of those seminal moments that forever fired my imagination. I thought a lot about that movie as I was reading The Houdini Specter, the third in novelist Daniel Stashower's series, The Harry Houdini Mysteries. The novels capture an imagined moment in time when Houdini already possessed an enormous ego for his prestidigitation and deductive skills, but had yet to earn it with anyone outside of his immediate family. The Houdini Spectre is a wild romp, good story, terrific characters in Harry and his brother Dash, and a taste of the future genius as young man. It also gave me a desire to investigate Stashower's other period piece, The Ectoplasmic Man, one of the future adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Daniel Stashower, welcome to Mr. Media.
Thank you, Bob.
I I was really captivated by the Houdini Spectre. It's like one of those what if Marvel comics from the 1970s, where we get to think, well, okay, the story actually went this way, but what if it went this way?
Yes. Yeah, exactly.
How did this series come about?
Well, for me, like you, I had grown up, I was very much influenced by that Paul Michael Glaser movie. But also, I don't know if you remember, in 1973, there was a show called The Magician,
Oh, Bill
starring
Bixby.
Bill Bixby.
Yep.
I loved this show. And like most kids, probably you went through a magic phase where you did a few tricks and then eventually exactly. And then it got hard and you have to kind of put it away. Well,
Exactly.
the Bill Bixby series came along at just the right time because here I was struggling with things like hippity hop rabbits and multiplying billiard balls. And here's Bixby, who played a character named Anthony Blake, and he's a headlining magician. And he lives on an airplane and he drives a white Corvette and he's got some kind of uh, eminence status at the Magic Castle. And every week we learn that there is no problem in the world that can't be solved by the skills of a really good magician. And he's always got just the right tools to hand. And for me, trying very hard to pull a rabbit out of a hat and not always succeeding, this looked pretty good. This looked pretty good. And my two worlds were colliding. I liked magicians and magic very much, but I was also a big detective fan. So the idea of a detective slash magician looked pretty good.
Hmm. Wasn't there was I was as you were talking about that there was one more magic. There was that movie called Magic. Was it Anthony
Yes,
Hopkins?
yes, and it was based on a William Goldman book, which was that was the classic ventriloquist dummy come to life story,
That was
which was really well done. Yeah, Anthony Hopkins and Anne Margaret. That was a great one.
that was some real creepy shit in that movie.
It really was. That was spooky. It was hard not to. I think the dummy's name was Corky,
Yeah.
and I was seeing Corky every time I closed my eyes for quite a while.
Oh, those 70s, it was such a magical decade. But so So we have the same shared early experience as far as magic goes. But how do you decide, or did someone come to you and say, "Hey, we'd like to do a mystery series with Harry Houdini," or was that your idea?
It kind of came about because my first novel was a Sherlock Holmes pastiche, a Sherlock Holmes novel. And I was crazy about these two things, as I said, magic and detective novels, and particularly Sherlock Holmes. And there were two books that were really big to me when I was growing up. And one was John Dixon Carr's biography of Arthur Conan Doyle.
Mm-hmm.
And the other was The Illustrated History of Magic.
Ooh.
And there was some overlap.
Still in its protective cover for your
Still,
hijack.
yeah, otherwise I would have spilled, any number of grape juice, peanut butter, any number of things on it. But there was overlap between the two books because Conan Doyle and Harry Houdini knew each other. And it seemed to me that there was a story to be told in the intersection between those two worlds. So in my first novel, Sherlock Holmes met Harry Houdini, and that kind of opened up a whole world of possibilities in terms of treating Houdini as a fictional character. And it's peculiar because Sherlock Holmes, well, I'll be hung out to dry by the Baker Street regulars for saying so. Sherlock Holmes was the fictional character. I've spent a lot of my career writing nonfiction about Conan Doyle,
Mm-hmm.
the real character, but then I've gone and written a whole lot of fiction about Houdini, who was a real guy.
It's something warped about all that.
Yes, yeah. Many things in my life that could be said about.
There you go. Yeah, I mean, and I wanted to ask you. I mean, you've got this real guy who you fictionalized, and this fictional guy who, I don't know.
I got no explanation for that. That's just how it came out.
So the first book, we talked before we went on the air. You were telling me about doing your first book. Basically, it came out of your graduate research, right?
It did. I was in a graduate writing program, and everybody was writing a novel about being a sensitive young person who took walks in the rain.
I love those.
And it turned out people didn't really understand. The people didn't understand. We were feeling a sense of alienation and all that, and it was all that kind of stuff. And I looked down, and to my horror, I was writing one of those books too. Because I too was lonely and alienated and not averse to taking walks in the rain. But this really wasn't very good, what I was doing. I would go so far as to say it was horrible. But I had this idea, geez, just as an exercise, what if somehow I did what you would now call a mashup of Sherlock Holmes and Harry Houdini? Mm-hmm. And I just wrote down some notes in the middle of the night, and those notes became sort of an outline, and then the outline became sort of a first chapter. And the next thing I knew, I had burned through about half of it and couldn't stop. So the Lonely Young Man novel got put aside, never to return, never to be revived. And I went ahead and finished the Sherlock Holmes book.
Wow. So what do you have against sensitive young writers?
Well, I used to be one myself, so nothing. It just turned out that was not where my interests lay. No. And so, to one extent or another, most of the things I've written have had to do with either magic and magicians, usually Houdini, or Sherlock Holmes and Conan Doyle. I wrote a biography of Conan Doyle. I co-edited a collection of his letters, and I've done a lot of work in that line. And then my fiction has all tended to have to do with the magic world.
I mean, you've been doing this for, I think we did the math, about 27 years now.
Yeah.
You have not written any books outside of this this little magic detective?
I guess I have. I have written some nonfiction and certainly any number of magazine articles, newspaper pieces that don't have to do with it. But for the most part, it has been magic. And my nonfiction has had to do with historical true crime.
Oh, okay.
Sort of in the same venue. My last book was called The Beautiful Cigar Girl, and it was about the real life story that inspired Edgar Allan Poe's Mystery of Marie Roget.
Oh,
And my next book coming out next year will be about Alan Pinkerton, the 19th century detective.
well, that sounds cool. Now, is that fiction or nonfiction?
That's nonfiction.
Really?
That's
See,
not.
because I would think that's one of those guys who you would think would lend itself to.
Absolutely it is. Pinkerton is one of those guys like Houdini, who, if you were making him up out of whole cloth, it would almost seem too good to be true, which kind of comes back to a point you were making earlier. Houdini had these amazing talents. He was an athletic marvel. He had a gift for creating and solving puzzles. He had seemingly unlimited resources. It was almost too good to be true, using him as a fictional character. And one of the ways I worked around that so that everything didn't just come too easily was to put him in the poor and struggling phase of his career so that he knows where he's going. He's a bright young man on the way up, but the world hasn't yet recognized, as he sees it, the world hasn't acknowledged his genius, as it one day inevitably must. So he's still got hurdles to cross. There are still problems to be solved, and he's not simply the guy who can solve any problem just by throwing all his resources at it.
Now, how much research did you do before starting this series or each book with Houdini, in terms of, because it is a real person, how important is it to you to be, true to certain facts, and then what kind of things can you discard?
It is important to not to sort of break faith with the reader. It's hard to say how much research I do, because this has been an enthusiasm of mine for most of my life, and so I do tend to keep reading all the time on magic and magicians. But I'll read the specific stuff that I need to come up to speed on any particular book. Like, for instance, the second book in the series, The Floating Lady, that was featured the magician Harry Keller, and I needed to I needed to brush up on my Harry Keller before I could go ahead with that. But at the same time, I try not to be, for want of a better word, handcuffed by the facts. Because it's fiction, there are certain things that I'll let go of. I can't tell you how many letters I get, emails I should say, because in my books, they always start out, there's a scene where Harry and Bess and Dash are at his mother's breakfast table, and she speaks English.
She didn't speak English.
She did not speak English.
Yiddish, wasn't it?
Yep, but in my world, she speaks English. There's a universal translator effect. It's like the Enterprise or Doctor Who. We've got a universal translator working so that she can speak English. I probably should have said so in some way. Having Dash, the narrator, say, "I've recorded this in English. Of course, she spoke," but it just seemed too much trouble to translate everything and then translate it back.
Well,
so for my purposes, she speaks English, and I take comfort in the fact that Conan Doyle was also known to take certain liberties with the facts when necessary. So can't do much better than that as a role model.
Well, and you couldn't really have anyone drop in on the Houdini household for dinner with Mama if they didn't speak the same language. It wouldn't,
Right. Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
That makes sense.
But by the same token, I would not have, Abraham Lincoln drop in on the apartment either, because you do have to stick with the timeline. You do have to stick with the facts enough so that you simply don't throw these head-snapping inconsistencies or anachronisms at people. So I do try to stay true to the spirit of Houdini's times and his actual life story without absolutely suppressing any life that might come into the story.
Although you could perhaps have a young actor who happened to be last name of Glazer cross paths with Harry sometime in the entertainment, in the
I suppose Tony Curtis would have been more likely. And what was his name? Was it Bernie Schwartz?
Yeah.
That maybe.
Well, I'll be looking for that now.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, that was another movie I watched and enjoyed very much when I was a kid.
I saw that one after the Glazer one. Of course, the Channel 9 reruns and
Hmm.
WOR and stuff. But yeah, it's the Glazer version that always stuck with me. It seemed more, I don't know, striking in some ways.
Well, also, I think it's important when these things cross your path, come across your field of vision, because for me, even though, and you and I are more or less the same generation, uh, for me, Basil Rathbone is my Sherlock Holmes,
Mm,
even though he was done making those before I was born.
right.
But they were the ones that were on Sunday morning television, or Saturday afternoon television on the old UHF channel. So those were the ones I saw when I was at that impressionable age when they really registered and hit home.
So, since you mentioned that, I'll ask you, with the Sherlock Holmes work, you've obviously been working on it long before the Robert Downey films and the Benedict Cumberbatch
Oh,
BBC
sure.
series. But is that stuff, the popularity of that stuff, is it helping your books?
I like to think so. I mean, it's fashionable among some Sherlock Holmes enthusiasts and Baker Street irregulars to sort of get up in arms because Robert Downey Jr. and Benedict Cumberbatch are not that canonical, as they would say. It's not all that true to the original stories. But to my way of thinking, they're certainly true to the spirit of the original stories. They're very clever, obviously.
Mm.
They're good in and of themselves on their own merits, and I think they're bringing new readers. They're bringing people who are going to work their way upstream to the original stories, and that's got to be good for Sherlock Holmes and as you say, for me. And what's good for me is good for America.
I promise you a Sherlock Holmes book in every pot. Um,
Well, there ought to be.
Yeah, there ought to
There
be.
ought.
Well, I mean, I see that in my own household. 6 months ago, let's say maybe 9 months ago, my daughter didn't know Sherlock Holmes from. Well, okay,
Right.
let's go back a little further because of the Downey movies. Let's say before she saw the first Downey movie, she didn't know Sherlock Holmes, and we had to drag her to it. And she loved the first one. She loved the second one. Meanwhile, the Benedict Cumberbatch BBC Sherlock series starts hitting the shores here, and girls of that age, the teenage girls. I
That's
mean,
true.
he's got the craziest name ever for an
Yes.
actor,
Yeah.
but
That name is almost too good to be true.
I mean, there are porn stars that wish they had thought of that name. But I mean, it's incredibly well done. Whether you're a Baker Street irregular or not, it's very thoughtful. But it's very interesting too that there's such a huge gulf between Robert Downey's Sherlock Holmes and Benedict Cumberbatch's. I mean, Downey's Holmes has all the physical skills and he can do everything. I don't see Benedict Cumberbatch like lifting a finger to fight off an attacker. Really, I mean, it's all mental aerobics with him.
One of the geniuses of that character, though, which has always been true for going back to Conan Doyle's time, is that each generation can reinterpret the character and sort of project elements of themselves onto Sherlock Holmes. So he becomes a reflection of the time in which he's interpreted. And I think that's great, but it also means that the individual actors who do it suffer from something that I think of as the Doctor Who regeneration effect. As soon as Christopher Eccleston turns into David Tennant, there are going to be a lot of people who say, "Oh gosh, I'm sure David Tennant is good, but I love Christopher Eccleston," and it takes them a while to warm up. So I can't tell you how many people come up to me and say, "Well, Robert Downey Jr.'s that's fine, but he's no Jeremy Brett." Well, yeah, he's not. It's different.
Right.
It's a different time. It's a different actor. It's a different interpretation. And when Jeremy Brett came along, all those same people were wringing their hands and saying, "Well, this is very pretty to look at, but he's no Basil Rathbone."
Mm.
And the truth is, there's value in most of these interpretations, and it's interesting to see how the character gets spun by each generation that comes along. And you're certainly seeing things now, and the Benedict Cumberbatch is probably an exception because it's set in the present day.
Mm.
But it is amazing how many of the things from the original stories translate seamlessly into this modern day setting, starting with Dr. Watson having served in Afghanistan.
Right, right. Well, so two questions. Can you enjoy either the film series with Downey or the TV series with Cumberbatch without, getting all wrapped up in, whether it's close enough to the original Arthur Conan Doyle?
I find as I get older, I have the ability to switch off my pedantic Dan switch. I'll go into the movie just to enjoy it and not to pick apart the inconsistencies or the failures to adhere to the text and admire the clever things that they've done to interpret it. I don't mean to draw invidious comparisons, but it's not like Hamlet hasn't been reinterpreted and done in different ways over the centuries. I mean, how many times have you seen a modern dress interpretation of Macbeth or Taming of the Shrew or whatever? And it turns out Shakespeare can survive that, and so can Sherlock Holmes.
So there's yet another Sherlock series coming up, Elementary on CBS, which takes yet another liberty with the story and turns Dr. Watson into an Asian woman, setting aside the fact that the series takes place in New York. Now, I have my own personal issues with Elementary because I actually had there was a show based on a book that I did that was one of the finalists for that spot on CBS. There were three. I think there were three shows that it came down to for that last position, and mine was one of them. It was called Trooper, for anyone who wants to look it up, with Mira Sorvino. And so for that reason alone, and the fact that that would have paid my daughter's tuition, I'm completely against this show, Elementary.
I feel your pain.
But, obviously none of us has really seen it yet, but how do you feel about that proposed liberty with the story?
I'm absolutely going to reserve judgment, because if you and I were talking a couple of years ago and you had said, well, they're going to do this show called Sherlock, and it's going to be set in the present day, and it stars as Dr. Watson, it's going to be Jim from the British version of The Office, I would have said, oh, that's going to be terrible. Oh no, and I probably made that fuff sound that people make. And of course, I sat down to watch it and loved it. So I am open to being pleasantly surprised at Elementary, and there are a lot of good people connected with it. So I will watch it with an open mind.
I'll try. I can't promise.
Well, you've got a history.
I've got a financial interest there. And the funny thing is, I won't go off. I only found out that this show this pilot had been made based on a book that I'd written called The Profiler, the week that the decisions were made. I mean, I had no idea up until that week. I know. Don't ask.
That doesn't even seem possible.
Yeah, I know. And it's who's the guy who does the CSI series? The producer.
Yeah.
Jerry. Can't even think.
Weintraub.
No. The other guy. Mm-hmm. He also does the Pirates of the Caribbean series. Anyway,
right.
It was his. Yeah, and so I didn't find out until like days before the decision was made, and then it was like, oh, God, so close.
Barely had time to have the fantasy about the island you were going to buy.
Hollywood. So let me ask you this. Let's switch back to Houdini for a sec, and obviously we'll have to start winding down. But any response? I don't know. I don't seem to recall that Houdini had children. Did he?
No, there are descendants. They're just not direct descendants. Okay. And there was a niece or a great niece of his who a lot of Houdini's admirers were in touch with a few years ago. That was trying to keep the flame alive, and there have been people who've turned up who worked as assistants to him and things like that. But no, he and Bess, played by Sally Struthers in the version you remember, did not have children.
Right. And so, has there been any family or descendants that you've heard from who've had any thought on this?
Yes. Pretty distant, and they seem to like it. They like the relationship between the brothers. You know, the books are narrated by Houdini's younger brother, Dash, who's a real figure. And so my idea there was to have sort of an inverted Holmes and Watson relationship where, Houdini was sort of the front man and Dash was doing the legwork behind the scenes. And the people who do claim a family connection that I hear from seem to enjoy that. What they seem to think is Dash getting his due after all these years in Harry's shadow.
Well, that's very nice. Yeah, it's a nice relationship. It's sort of that Holmes and Watson thing, sort of that buddy comedy, the cop,
Yes, yes.
It's got a lot of that kind of thing. What about this aspect? You've, in some ways, with the Sherlock Holmes book, you've kind of stepped into those Arthur Conan Doyle shoes. The Harry Houdini thing is more an original, an original, if we can say that, of a real person. But what do you think about? We've seen a lot of writers stepping into a lot of shoes. I mean, I had Max Allan Collins on the show recently, and he's fixing up and completing a lot of Mickey Spillane books. There have been people who have done Mario Puzo characters. There's been a new Godfather book. We have new Ian Fleming, James Bond stories. Is there? We're probably going to see a lot more of this. Is there a limit in your mind to where we should go and where we shouldn't go with doing this, or is it all open season?
I can only speak to my own experience, which is that when I was writing my Sherlock Holmes pastiche, and that's really the first time and one of the few times I've really tried to walk in another man's shoes, another writer's shoes. It was how I learned to write a book. For me, that was, I was 20, 21, 22 years old in a sweltering studio apartment in New York City, pretending to be Dr. Watson, an older British gentleman, and it felt right somehow. And by walking in those footsteps, by the time I was done writing that book, I was ready to work without a net. And my next book was my own characters and my own situation and my own walking on my own 2 feet without training wheels. Mm-hmm. That's how it worked for me. But of course, a lot of the examples that you give aren't that, are something very different. I don't know where it'll all end. I mean, who knew that Abraham Lincoln was a vampire slayer? It seems that that it's very much in the wind now. Yeah. And where it will all end, I don't know.
These historical figures, because the last 120 years we've had so much media that didn't exist before. We've taken a lot of real life characters and turned them into characters, basically.
Yeah.
But I think when I was in high school and reading like everything that came in front of me, I always thought I was reading like Peter Ma's books and the Serpico and I was thinking of John Steinbeck and Travels with Charlie and Mice and Men, Grapes of Wrath, and I always thought I'd like to write like these people, but I never thought about writing new. I never thought about taking Charlie out for a spin.
Yeah.
And doing. But I'm not objecting to it because I'm enjoying. I enjoy a lot of this. But I also wonder. I mean, personally, let me ask you this. Personally, is there a writer or a writer's character that you do not want to see, continued or given new adventures, so to speak?
Well, it's funny. I do know of some writers who are still with us, who've been approached by about having their characters continued by others, and I guess that would be a case where nobody who's still in a sitting up taking solid food and drinking liquids really wants to say, well, gosh, go ahead. I can't do anything more with it. But we have seen a lot of examples lately, like say Robert B. Parker and things like that. The Spencer books are carrying on under a new writer. I don't know what the end of it will be, and I don't know how long the public's appetite for it will continue. But to return to your point about, the writers you read, the writers you absorb, the writers that inspire you, everybody does that, whether they're doing it consciously or not. I mean, everybody who subsequently becomes a reader is influenced in some way by all the writers they've read before. I mean, not to go all Harold Bloom and anxiety of influence on you, but that you can't help but internalize at least some aspect, whether it's the characters, the plot, or the style itself, of the books you read. I mean, who among us hasn't put down The Great Gatsby and just wanted to run to the typewriter because you're so inspired by the lyricism of it. So I certainly do understand the impulse. I just the motives are not always pure behind some of these continuations.
Well, and you're right. Sometimes it's the family has gotten used to living off of the royalties from a very creative member of the family, and suddenly they start tailing off, and it's like, geez, how can we make more money so we don't have to work? Let's hire a writer to continue Dad's work,
Well, and as I say, a lot of things have to line up right for that to work. Finding the right person, updating the character without losing what originally made it great. I think, to quote Little Big Man, sometimes the magic works, sometimes it doesn't.
Fair enough. Well, speaking of magic, last question. What's next out for you? What do you have coming up?
Next year, I have a book coming out called The Hour of Peril, which is about the detective Alan Pinkerton and his life and career, and specifically his role in the 1861 attempted assassination of Abraham Lincoln in Baltimore. It was a very, very fun book to do. This is nonfiction, and the research was massive but fascinating. I've never enjoyed research more.
Pinkerton sounds like he'd be a good subject for an AMC series,
Well, from your lips, yes.
I'll do what I can, but I think you're on your own.
Please, yeah, I hear you have some pull. It was a real pleasure, Bob. Thank you. Hope to talk to you again.
You can see and hear almost 1,000 Mr. Media interviews by visiting our main site, mrmedia.com, mrmedia.com. Or check out the more than 200 video interviews on the Mr. Media radio site on YouTube. And I'd sure appreciate if you'd show some love for Mr. Media's advertisers, including Stitcher. Apple named Stitcher a top 5 news app of 2011. It's a free mobile app for your smartphone or tablet that lets you listen to your favorite shows and discover the best of news, entertainment, and sports on demand. You can listen whenever you want to more than 5,000 shows, get customized recommendations, and discover what your friends are listening to. My own list of Stitcher favorites is pretty eclectic. I start my day with an hour of MSNBC's Morning Joe with Joe Scarborough and Mika Brzezinski. Then it's the latest 2-minute update from the Onion News Network. After that, I'll listen to WTF with Mark Maron, Here's the Thing with Alec Baldwin, HBO's Real Time with Bill Maher, and excerpts from E's Chelsea Lately and The Soup with Joel McHale. Also in regular rotation on my Stitcher playlist, the BS Report with ESPN's Bill Simmons, the TechCrunch headlines, and the Don Geronimo Show. The latest episodes of each show, whether originating from broadcasts, cable TV, radio syndication, or podcasts, are continuously updated. Stitcher is a free app for your iPhone, iPad, Kindle, Fire, BlackBerry, Droid, and more. And show your support of Mr. Media by getting, did I mention it's free? The app at stitcher.com/Mr. Media. That's stitcher.com/MR Media. Stitcher Smart Radio, the smarter way to listen to radio. We're also supported by Audible. Check out Audible's 30-day trial membership and download the audiobook version of the book everyone's been talking about, 50 Shades of Grey by E.L. James. Sign up for your free trial today at audible.com/radio. Again, audibletrial.com/radio. And finally, if you need a disc jockey for a wedding, bar mitzvah, corporate event, or just a big old party, please consider calling 1-800-DIAL-DJs, the party authority for all your party entertainment needs. You can call 1-800-DIAL-DJs or go to their website, 1-800-DIAL-DJs.com, and tell them Mr. Media sent you. And thanks for listening.